as far as like access is concerned, especially like a local residence, like how do you handle parking? I mean, that's true of anything, really.
It is.
But especially like local residents. I mean, because if you have 150 people come into your neighborhood, I mean, there can only be 150 houses. So
right. And you have to imagine, right? Like if you take your guest list and divide it by 2, that's how many people are going to be driving in.
Oh, that's fair.
You know, maybe it's just a rough estimate, but you have 150 people. I mean, we're talking about 75 cars.
It's a lot of cars.
That's a lot of cars to park. I mean, even if you live in a ginormous neighborhood, people are going to be walking for miles in heels and nice dresses. And that's not the experience you want to create for your guests.
Right.
So the first thing to kind of think about is there a way to offer a valet? You know, can we set up a valet, and then where do those cars go? So whether maybe you live in a big neighborhood and there's plenty of parking for these cars. It's just that it's, you know, going to be a mile away.
Right.
So then, you know, you can kind of reserve those spots, talk to your HOA or your neighborhood or whatever you need to kind of get approval on, and then talk to a valet service. Are they going to need a car for the valet to kind of like shuttle them back and forth because it's so far and everyone's coming at the same time, right? It's not like when you go out to dinner and everyone's kind of just arriving. Like we're talking about like prime time here. Everyone's arriving at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another option can be, you know, everyone parks maybe at a nearby church or a nearby school that's going to be shut on a Saturday. Maybe you get permission for that, a bank, and then shuttle everybody from there. So that could be a good option as well. You know, make sure you talk to your neighbors, find out, and maybe all your neighbors are invited and they're like, yeah, everybody.
Well, that'd be awkward.
Yeah. Either way, you should talk to your neighbors. just let them know the party's going on. Yeah.
You're not invited, but
right.
You can still send a gift.
Exactly. So either way, you need to talk to your neighbors, and probably invite them, or at least give them a nice gift, because you're probably going to be loud if it's in your neighborhood.
Sure.
But you want to talk to them and find out, you know, can we have a couple of our guests park in, you know, your driveway, especially like people who maybe older guests or people who can't walk as far, you know, maybe that's VIP parking for them. So different things like that are options that you could explore.
Sure. And you could sell that too. VIP parking,
You would say that.
Yeah, I would.
Yeah.
Yeah. All access pass.
Exactly.
You get 5-minute meet and greet with the couple.
You would say that.
Yeah. Well,
okay.
I mean, you got to give the people what the people want.
That's right.
Yeah. So what about, to take it back to reality, what about vendor trucks and loading and unloading? And I mean, that can, even at a traditional venue, that can be painful. So
yeah, I mean, no matter what venue you're at, it's something you have to think about. Yeah. Everybody kind of wants to arrive at the same time, especially it's, you know, if there's lots of parking and access and, you know, you're not in the city or at a house, it's easier. But where you're running into this issue is if you have limited parking or limited access to a parking deck or limited access to a loading dock or things like that. Mm-hmm. So you want to make sure that you schedule out your vendor arrivals to not have everybody arriving at the same time and give everyone fair access to the loading area. This is especially true in a backyard because you're not going to have as much space. So you're going to want to make sure that you're having people arrive at different times, unloading, and you're giving them plenty of time to move their trucks and things like that to wherever they need to go. So that's another thing you need to think about. Where are all these trucks and things like that going to park? Right. So you're going to want to think about them as well in the parking situation.
Yeah, I think that's something that, I mean, I know I wouldn't think about that. I mean,
right.
Yeah. So, and then we've already touched on this a little bit, but as far as like restrooms and vendor storage and things like that, like where, you know, your heating trays and your ice and your restrooms, like all those things, like where does that go?
Yeah, I mean, you're going to want to think about maybe having like a small additional tent space for your vendors besides your caterers as well, so they can put their gear in there. You can put a table in there for them to eat. Right. Unless you want them eating with your guests, they're going to need a place to sit down too and, you know, eat their dinner after being with you for 8-10 hours of the day, probably more if it's a backyard wedding. Right. You know, you're planning. I
wasn't trying to trigger you.
No. But you want to think about that. And then like for your catering tent, like you might want to think about putting sides on that tent so that you don't see the caterers, you know, working on those heating trays and things like that. And lighting as well in there. You're going to want to think about that because if you're having dinner and it's getting dark, you want to make sure your caterer has enough, you know, light to be able to see what's what they're cooking, or after the cake is cut,
Yeah.
making sure that they can cut the cake and see it. So those are things that, and then, clean up as well.
Sure. Yeah.
So you got to think about that throughout the whole night.
Yeah.
Another thing to think about that I didn't really touch on is sound ordinance. If you're going to be outside and you're going to be either in a neighborhood or, even if it's in the city, your city or specific neighborhood might have sound ordinance. So that's something to look into if you need to have, security, or you need to alert the police that you're having this big party so that, they know, okay, if anything comes in, this is going on.
Yeah.
So those are other things you kind of have to think through as well.
And I know I've said this before, but I loved it when you and my boy Brandon did the silent disco at that one wedding. That was the one. It was so cool, but it was also really funny. Like when, as a vendor, running around, and just seeing all these people dancing and singing, and it's but there's no music.
But there's no music.
Yeah.
It's a really good workaround if there is a sound ordinance.
Yeah. Anyways, so how, as always, as couples are exploring using a blank space, whether they've considered it or they've already chosen one, and now they're like, oh, geez, what do I do now?
Yeah.
What next best steps would you suggest for our couples?
I would suggest you start early. There's a lot of additional steps using a non-traditional venue, whether that be all the things of a backyard wedding or even just a, blank space like a museum. There can be additional steps that you have to think through, and you really want to give yourself time to come up with your design. And I would suggest that you work with vendors who have experience working in these non-traditional type venues and can give you guidance. Obviously, we have a ton of vetted options over at Bustld, so go check those out. But use your vendor team, ask for advice.
Yeah.
Don't think that you have to know everything because they've done this before.